You ever think a window stumbles upon a bear watching a group of hikers in the woods and asks, "Are you going to eat that?" And the bear just sort of raises one big bear eyebrow and walks away? I'm sorry, I'm having too many shower thoughts today. Maybe I should just turn the shower off. I've been in here for 3 hours and I still stink. Hey, welcome back, friends. I've got an assortment of scary and true work-related stories for you. About kidnappers, murderers, and an epic collection of scary stories from a park guide who has witnessed horror and the unexplained.
Story 1.
I've been a wilderness guide at one of America's state parks for almost a decade. I'm not going to name which one, partly because I still work there and I enjoy this job, but also because management has made it abundantly clear they do not appreciate staff sharing certain experiences that may affect tourism. What I'm about to share with you happened over the course of my employment, and while I can't prove everything, I've tried to record the events as accurately as my memory allows. Most days are perfectly normal. I lead hiking groups, point out native plants, explain conservation efforts, and answer questions about wildlife. The park sees thousands of visitors annually, and 99% of the time, everything goes exactly as planned. It's that other 1% that keeps me awake on some nights. I'll call the first story The Observer. This incident began about 3 years into my employment. I was leading an early morning bird-watching hike when I noticed him. A tall, rail-thin man standing just off the trail. He wasn't dressed like our typical visitors. While most people wore appropriate hiking gear, he had on a button-up shirt, slacks, and dress shoes that looked decades out of style. Not exactly wilderness attire. He wasn't even part of my group, but I nodded politely as we passed. He didn't acknowledge me, just stood perfectly still, watching us through thick glasses. I thought it was odd, but figured he was just socially awkward, so I continued the tour. Over the next few weeks, I kept seeing the man, always alone, always in similar outdated clothing regardless of the weather, and always watching. Not the scenery, though. He was watching the people. He carried a small notebook and would write in it whenever visitors or staff did anything, however mundane. After the third sighting, I mentioned him to my supervisor. I'll just call him Dave. "Oh, you mean the accountant," Dave said with a shrug. "He's harmless. Been coming here for years." "The accountant?" I asked. "That's what we call him. Nobody knows his real name. He never causes trouble, so management leaves him alone." That might have been the end of it. But a month later, I was leading a geology walk when I spotted him again. This time, he was methodically photographing our park vehicles in the staff parking lot. Something about his systematic approach really bothered me. During my lunch break, I decided to approach him. As I got closer, I noticed he was mapping out something in his notebook. It appeared to be the staff parking area with license plate numbers carefully documented. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you with something?" I asked. He looked up, his expression unnervingly blank. "I'm cataloging," he said in a flat voice. "Cataloging what exactly?" I asked. "Patterns, personnel movements, access points." He flipped through his notebook, showing pages of staff names, arrival times, and vehicle information. My name was in there with surprising details about my schedule. "Why are you tracking park employees?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. "This isn't the only location," he replied, ignoring my question. "There are others, all connected. Do you have special permissions?" "What? I don't understand what you mean," I said. "For the restricted areas, the non-public sections." He leaned in closer. "Have you seen anything unusual during your employment?" I radioed security, but by the time they arrived, the man had walked away. I filed a report, but management didn't seem particularly concerned. They confirmed he had been visiting regularly for at least 10 years, yet somehow we had no actual ID of him on file. The observer disappeared for about 8 months after that. When he returned, something was different. His hair color had changed slightly, and he wore different glasses, but his mannerisms and clothing style remained identical. It was as if someone had created a slightly updated version of him. He still visits occasionally, and other staff have reported him asking similar questions about restricted areas and special permissions. Management never removes him from the premises despite some visitor complaints about his staring. Sometimes I wonder if they know exactly who he is, and that frightens me more than the man himself. The next story I'll share with you is the creek crawler. This one is harder to rationalize away. It started with rumors among the seasonal guides about something living in the northern creek system. Most dismissed it as the usual campfire tales used to spook newbies, but there was some consistency in the reports that made me curious. Indigenous legends of the area mentioned a skin thief or hollow man that hunted near the water. Though most anthropologists classify these as cautionary tales to keep children away from dangerous waterways, the stories stuck with me. Last August, we received warning of a severe thunderstorm system approaching the park. Standard procedure is to evacuate all backcountry campsites. I was assigned to check a remote site near the northern creek, the same area featured in those legends. I reached the campsite around 3 p.m., with the storm front visible on the horizon. The site was abandoned, but in a concerning way. The tent was torn up, not collapsed. Personal belongings were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry, or rather, a panic. But there was no blood, no obvious signs of an animal attack, just the unsettling sense that something had gone very wrong. I radioed it in and was told to return immediately due to the encroaching storm. The fastest route back was the creek trail, which follows the water for about 3 miles before connecting to the main path. With darkness falling early due to the storm clouds, visibility was poor. About a mile in, I heard splashing in the creek that did not match the pattern of flowing water. Initially, I assumed it was wildlife. We've got otters, beavers, and deer, but the splashing seemed to be following my movements. When I stopped, it would stop too, and when I began to walk again, it came with me. I quickened my pace, thoroughly convinced it was just my nerves and the approaching storm playing tricks on my hearing. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. There was definitely something pacing me in the creek bed. In the dim light, I could only make out a vague shape, but it appeared to be moving on all fours in this awkward, unnatural manner. It was roughly human-sized, but moved with a jerky, crawling motion. No normal person would move that way. I told myself it must be a bear, though the movement pattern was still wrong. The trail eventually crossed the creek via a small footbridge. As I hurried across, I felt something reach up from below and grab hold of my ankle with enough force to leave a bruise. I fell hard, dropping my flashlight, which rolled away and illuminated something pulling itself up onto the bridge. What I saw in that brief moment will haunt me for the rest of my days. It had a humanoid shape, but with long, lanky limbs. The skin was pale but appeared waterlogged, with patches missing to reveal something dark underneath. The face was horrible, almost human but distorted, with wide eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I kicked free and scrambled backward, grabbing my hiking pole. The creature lunged at me, and I thrust the pole at it in defense. The metal tip connected with what I think was its shoulder, causing it to emit a high-pitched keening sound that did not sound human nor animal. There was a burst of lightning, and when I looked again, the creature was gone. I ran the rest of the way back without stopping. I reported the incident immediately, showing the dark, viscous fluid on my hiking pole and the bruises forming on my ankle. Management took the pole, documented my injuries, and placed me on paid leave for 3 weeks, officially listing it as trauma following hazardous weather conditions. When I came back to work, my pole had been replaced with a new one, and no matter what I did, they would not let me have the old one back. I was informed that my report had been filed as a possible wildlife encounter, species undetermined. My requests to see the analysis of the substance on the pole were denied. Later, I learned through another guide that over the last 5 years, hikers had gone missing in that same creek area. All cases classified as presumed wilderness misadventure, and these cases had no bodies recovered. The creek section has since been closed for environmental restoration, whatever that means, and no staff are assigned there alone. I've refused all assignments in that area of the park, and management has not pushed the issue, which tells me they definitely know more than they're letting on. I'll call this next incident the White Pines Trail phenomenon. It took place during my 5th year at the park. We have a trail that's pretty famous, but I'm just going to call it White Pines Loop. It's about 4 miles of moderate hiking through one of the oldest sections of forest. This trail isn't particularly remarkable, except for one strange pattern I noticed after reviewing incident reports during a safety training session. Over a span of several years, various hikers had reported a nearly identical experience. They'd somehow lost their hiking companion on the trail despite never separating. In each case, the missing person was eventually found waiting at the trailhead, insisting they'd been there for hours after getting separated from their group. Each missing person reported feeling suddenly disoriented before finding themselves back at the trailhead. Management dismissed these as simple navigational confusion, but the similarity of the reports caught my attention. All of these incidents I read about occurred along the same half-mile stretch of trail. all between 3 and 5 p.m., and all during the month of October. Strangely enough, so when October came around that year, I volunteered to lead as many White Pines tours as possible. I wanted to observe this stretch of trail myself. For weeks, nothing unusual happened. Then, on the 13th, while leading a group of 5 hikers, I got my chance. We reached the infamous section around 3 p.m. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings and kept counting my group over and over to be sure. The area looked fine. Nothing crazy, nothing odd at all. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I did another head count. 4 hikers. Someone had gone missing. A middle-aged man I'll call Paul. He had been hiking with his wife, but he had vanished. His wife, Linda, was understandably concerned. "He was right beside me just a minute ago," she insisted. "I was telling him about the bird we saw, and when I turned to point, he was just gone." We backtracked about 30 yards. No side trails, no steep drops. Nothing that could explain a sudden disappearance. So I radioed it in. We conducted a brief search of the immediate area while waiting for backup rangers. "Did you hear anything unusual before you noticed Paul was missing?" I asked his wife. "No, nothing. But right before I noticed, I felt strange. My ears popped, and for a second everything went quiet. I thought it was just altitude or pressure. That detail wasn't in any of the reports I'd read. When the backup arrived, I was instructed to continue the hike with the remaining guests while they conducted a more thorough search. Standard procedure would have been to evacuate everyone, so this instruction surprised me. It seemed to me that they expected Paul to turn up at the trailhead. Sure enough, when we completed the loop an hour later, there was Paul, sitting on a bench by the trailhead map, looking unharmed but bewildered. A park ranger was already with him, taking notes. I approached them as my group reunited with Paul amid relieved hugs and questions. "I don't understand what happened," Paul explained. "One minute I was walking next to my wife, the next I felt dizzy. Everything went quiet, and suddenly I was standing at the start of the trail." According to my watch, that was over 2 hours ago. I checked my watch against his. Mine showed 5 p.m., but his had stopped at 3 p.m. The ranger interviewing Paul looked up at me with a warning expression. "Thanks for bringing the rest of the group back safely. I'll handle the report on this one." Later that evening, I attempted to access the incident report but found it had been classified as a medical event, and the rest of it was restricted. When I asked my supervisor about it, he became uncharacteristically stern. "We're not going to discuss that. If it's about the White Pines, I don't want to hear it." I pressed him for more info, and the most I got from him was that some places are just weird. My final story is called The Double Hiker. It's perhaps the strangest of them all, as it defies any rational explanation I've been able to come up with. Last spring, I was leading a small group of 8 hikers on our Ridgeline Trail, a moderate 6-mile loop with spectacular valley views. Among them was a middle-aged woman named Karen, wearing distinctive bright yellow hiking pants and a blue windbreaker. About 2 miles in, we stopped at a small waterfall for photos and a water break. I did a quick head count. Only 7 people. Karen was missing, but no one had seen her turn back. Just as I was about to radio for assistance, another guide called in to say that Karen was actually at the main vista point. That was confusing for me. The vista point was still over a mile ahead. There were no shortcuts or alternate routes. I assumed there must be another woman with similar clothing, so we continued our hike. When we made it to the visitor point maybe 15 minutes later, there was Karen taking photos of the valley. I approached her, asking if she'd somehow gone ahead of the group. "No, I've been with everyone the whole time," she insisted, looking confused by my question. I didn't push it then, figuring I may have miscounted earlier. We completed the loop and returned to the visitor center at approximately 6 p.m. I was filling out my tour report when, to my shock, Karen walked through the front entrance at 6:30 p.m., still wearing the same distinctive yellow pants and blue jacket. This second Karen approached me, apologizing for falling behind the group. She claimed she had stopped to photograph a bird and lost sight of us, eventually finding her way back to the center on her own. I was stunned. I checked my photos from the tour. I found images of Karen at the waterfall rest stop, and separate images of her already at the vista point when our group arrived. In one group photo taken by another hiker, she appears in the background at the vista point while simultaneously being captured in the foreground with our group. I discreetly showed these photos to Karen, expecting her to have some explanation, maybe a twin or a relative of some sort. The color drained from her face as she stared at the images. "That's not possible," she whispered. I could see her hands shaking as she held my camera. I was never at the overlook ahead of the group. That's me, definitely me, with the same clothes, the same everything, but it's not me. I don't remember making that pose or being there alone. When we checked the visitor center security footage, it clearly showed Karen entering with our group at 4:45 p.m., with no prior entry that day. Yet my time-stamped photos showed her at the Vista Point well before our group arrived. As Karen reviewed her own camera, her distress grew. "These aren't my photos," she said, scrolling through images of trail sections, rock formations, not on our route. "I didn't take these." "I've never seen these places." Park administration intervened quickly, taking Karen to a private office and dismissing the tour group with complimentary passes. I was ordered to complete my report without mentioning the incident, and to delete any photos I'd taken. I've never seen Karen again, but occasionally I receive visitor evaluation forms where guests reference events or conversations from my tours that I have no memory of conducting. The Wicked Well from Oliver.
Story 2.
My name is Oliver. I'm in my 30s, and I work at an antique store downtown. Over the years, I've come across a variety of interesting items, but most days were quiet and, frankly, boring. Occasionally, we'd receive furniture older than I was. One day, while working my shift, I was sweeping the floors and completing my closing duties. Business had been slow due to a thunderstorm, and my boss had told me that once I finished the closing list, I could head home. As I was heading toward the back to put the broom up and grab the mop, I heard the doorbell jingle. I walked toward the front near the counter but didn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, feeling an odd chill run down my spine. That's when I noticed it, leaning against the wall, a beautiful painting. The painting depicted a wishing well in the middle of a wooded area during the fall. I was immediately captivated by it, yet I couldn't understand where it had come from or who had painted it. Strangely, there was no signature. I immediately called my boss to ask if anyone had dropped it off, but he had no idea what I was talking about. He said he would look into it the next day. I locked up and started my walk home, the whole time thinking about that painting. I wasn't particularly concerned about its strange appearance. Instead, I was focused on how badly I wanted it. It felt like craving a cigarette, a strange attachment I'd never felt to an object before. That night I lay in bed, imagining where I could hang it, and how I could spend hours admiring it once it was in my home. The next day, I woke up with an overwhelming urgency to get to work and check on the painting. I rushed out of my apartment, skipping my morning coffee, and practically sprinted to the shop. When I arrived, my boss greeted me and mentioned that he too had no idea where the painting had come from. I then asked, "So, what do you think it's worth?" With a chuckle, my boss replied, "Why? Are you interested in it?" I nodded, waiting for a more concrete answer. He paused before saying, "Well, considering there's no artist's signature and we don't know where it came from or how old it is, consider it yours." I was overwhelmed with excitement and strangely an urge to grab the painting and run home, but I couldn't just leave work unfinished. So I tried to focus on my duties, though every time I glanced at the painting, it became harder to look away. After closing the shop at the end of the day, I felt a sense of bliss knowing I would finally have 2 days off to enjoy the painting. I hung it in my living room, on the wall visible from my bedroom. My apartment was small, so even while lying in bed, I could see the painting. After hanging it, I sat in my chair, turned on the TV, and had a drink or two to relax. Soon, my eyes grew heavy, and suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, a woman's voice. I got up and searched around the room, trying to locate the source. When my eyes landed on the painting again, I froze. As I walked closer, I saw a woman in a white dress sitting on the edge of the well. My pulse quickened. No way, I thought. The woman was whispering from the painting, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. I leaned in closer to listen, and before I could process what was happening, the woman walked toward me, still whispering. In the blink of an eye, she grabbed me by my collar and began pulling me toward the painting. I pushed with all my strength against the wall, but I couldn't break free. Just as I was about to be pulled in, I woke up. I was sitting in my chair, the TV mumbling in the background. Shaken, I rushed over to the painting, and to my relief it appeared completely normal. I was still dazed, but chalked it up to the whiskey and being half asleep. I brushed my teeth and went to bed, but when I looked in the mirror, my reflection revealed something chilling. The right side of my shirt collar was torn. I froze. A wave of chills spread through my body, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I just needed more sleep. I shut my door to avoid looking at the painting and went to bed. At some point, I awoke to silence. I rolled out of bed and went into the living room to check on the painting. That's when I saw something disturbing. The background around the well had changed. The fall leaves had disappeared, replaced by a stark winter scene. The once colorful trees were now skeletal limbs, reaching out like hands. I was overcome with an insatiable urge to be near the painting. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling. The next 2 days passed with me constantly thinking about it. Monday arrived, and I found myself bored at work, so I decided to use the company laptop to do some research on the painting. I spent hours searching, even using a reverse image search, but found nothing. I concluded that it must have been created by a talented local artist. The weeks that followed, I couldn't stop obsessing over it. My dreams were filled with vivid images of the woman in white. My constant urge to be near the painting was accompanied by increasing fear, but I couldn't pull myself away. Finally, I decided to visit the local museum to see if I could find any information. I showed an older staff member a picture of the painting and asked if he had ever seen anything like it. "Ah, that's the Wicked Well," he said abruptly. "Follow me." He led me around a corner to a display case filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. There, I found a black and white photo of the well, surrounded by trees. One article was titled "The Wicked Well" and told the story of a woman and her 4 children, whose remains had been found in the well after being missing for over a year. The article was dated October 13th. The man explained that not many people had inquired about the well, and I could tell it unsettled him. He then showed me a photograph of the woman. My stomach twisted. There she was, in a white dress, just like the woman from the painting. I asked if he knew where the well was located, but he explained that after the remains were found, the well was sealed off, and any trace of it had been swallowed by years of foliage. Confused and shaken, I walked home in a daze. When I arrived, I decided to experiment. I poured myself a drink, needing to experience it again. It was like an addiction, being around the painting, no matter how uneasy it made me feel. After a few drinks, my eyelids grew heavy, and I once again heard the whispering. I got up, drawn toward the painting. As I neared it, the whispering grew softer, but when I leaned in close, the woman in white was gone. I felt 2 ice-cold hands on my back. I turned, and there she was, standing behind me, pushing me toward the painting. I fought and screamed, but she shoved me inside. Dizzy, I stumbled toward the well. There, etched into the stone, was my name. I ran my fingers over it, and suddenly, I woke up covered in sweat, sitting in my chair. Panicked, I locked myself in my room, distancing myself from the painting. The next day I took the painting behind my apartment and burned it. Watching it burn brought me a strange mixture of relief and grief. Since then, I've never kept a painting in my place. Occasionally, I still have nightmares about the woman in white. I wonder why it happened to me, what motivated the woman, and who the painting belonged to before me. These are questions I'll never have answers to.
Story 3.
I started as a firefighter back in the good year of 2001. It was a long process, with hours of training. A fresh memorial had been erected during my training for one of our senior firefighters who had perished in the line of duty. Apparently, he had gotten trapped in a burning home after getting some children out, and they found his remains hours after the fire had finally been put out. It had been discovered there had been accelerants in the blaze and a stove eye left on. The subsequent fire was brutal and killed 3 in total: the parents and Mr. Arlek, the firefighter who fought to save those kids. I wasn't quite sure how to pay respects to the brave man I hadn't known personally, so I just laid fresh flowers every month on his memorial and remembered him as what the ultimate price could be and what saving lives could risk. I watched the children grow up as I was in the service. They grew up quickly under the care of their aunt and became very skilled teenagers who had been on the honor roll several times by now. Mr. Arlek would have been proud of the lives he saved in the blink of an eye. It was when I had begun training new recruits myself, showing them the now aged memorial of Mr. Arlek, telling them of his bravery and the lives he saved in spite of his own. Every year, this left new trainees in awe and a somber respect, and several have taken to my tradition of flowers. I had begun to take on more serious fires in that summer, and I had calls in the span of a month. There was a drought, a thing most firefighters fear. During a drought, even the grass becomes more like a matchbox, ready to ignite. We saw a local farm go up in smoke, leading to the barn igniting. I remember hearing painful squeals of various animals. I wanted to retch. We managed to put the fire out, but by then all the animals inside had died, and the farmer was heartbroken as he witnessed the absolute devastation of his animals and crop. It was an unusual summer that year. Over time, the fire seemed targeted. We were extremely unsure of what or who could be doing these works of devastation, but it was clear that something was at work. Large farms, 2 family homes, and a local pub on the outskirts of town had fallen victim to these hungry flames. I was left like the other firefighters with speculations of who could be doing these fires. Was it just some crazy person who wanted to watch the world burn? A person thriving on the chaos and adoring the shell-shocked look of families? There's very little that escaped our notice when we went into the cases, reviewing them with the police for signs of arson. Everything looked mildly normal, minus a few issues such as the out-of-place gas tank, a motorcycle too close to a wall, left running, things like that. It seemed like stuff that could have been by accident, but with all these accidents, it sure seemed more like something deliberate going on. The police began to patrol areas more often. I would see a police officer almost every half hour, which was kind of unnerving, a frequent reminder that something was afoot. It was between these patrols one night where things seemed off. I was sitting in the firehouse doing some maintenance on the fire trucks when something felt weird. I had this urge to check around the fire station just in case, but when I did, I didn't find anything out of place. Wish I could say I was relieved after that, but I'd be lying. I was nervous. Years of training was telling me something was definitely wrong here, but I couldn't be sure of what it was. I kind of had this feeling like static in the air. The hairs on my arms were standing on end, and I felt chills rippling through me. I decided to look around outside the station, but once again, I found nothing. I was beginning to think I was being paranoid. I began to work back on the fire trucks, polishing the outside hoses. As I started to fill the tank with water, I then noticed something flickering from the corner of my eye. A candle. Honestly, it wouldn't have shocked me if someone had lit a candle to make the station smell better, but the flame moved out of sight, and that's when the alarm bells rang. I went to the windows, trying to peer at whatever was going on, only to see the flame dance around the building. So I panicked, thinking that someone was about to set the fire station itself on fire. I yanked open the door, chasing after the flame, but I didn't see anyone, just a flickering light. For a moment, it stood still, and I saw something new emerge from the flame. I swear to you, it morphed into a person's outline, standing beside the memorial. I was terrified, not really understanding what I was looking at, but the horror slowly melted away. I don't know why, but things felt calm, relaxing even, like everything was going to be okay. The person-shaped flame seemed to raise up what appeared to be an arm, like a salute, and instinctively, I returned the gesture. The figure seemed to shrink away then disappeared. When I came in the next day, I told the chief about what I saw. Then he explained to me how a serial arsonist had been captured trying to set fire to the local library. I was shocked, and I thought then that maybe that was Mr. Arlek leaving a sign to let us know that everything was going to be okay.
Story 4.
I've been holding on to this story for quite a long time, mostly due to not realizing the gravity of the situation until I was older, much older. This happened when I was in 10th grade. I was walking home from some volunteer work, minding my own business. It was a nice summer evening with a warm breeze. I was only about 3 blocks from my home. I remember everything clearly. I was right by a KFC on a main busy street when a truck pulled up on the side of the curb. Inside was a man I'd never seen before, possibly in his late 30s or early 40s. He proceeded to ask if I wanted a ride. I told him, "No, thank you." He then told me he was the uncle of this loser I was dating at the time and called him by name. He insisted again. "Come on, I'll give you a ride." He smiled lightly. He might have said other things, but I don't recall them right now. Being very naive, I said, "Okay." This was where I changed my mind in an instant. I had my hand on the door handle, already pulling it open. When I saw this man getting way too excited about me getting in his vehicle, as if he was shocked I'd said yes. I know, it wasn't smart. I'm aware of that now. He started to drop everything he had on his passenger seat to the car floor. Just junk. What seemed to be baby toys and sheets of paper. I remember looking forward at the street ahead of me as the sun was setting, thinking about this man's behavior. It was a beautiful evening. So I then just told him, "You know what? I'll just walk home. Thanks." I began to walk away. The guy looked so confused, but he said nothing and sped away. I went on with my daily routines, thinking nothing of it. I can't remember how much time passed. I want to say maybe a weekend. But the next time we hung out, it was my sister, a girlfriend, and the loser boyfriend. I brought the event up calmly as I didn't see it as a big deal. The conversation went as follows. I said, "Hey, your uncle offered me a ride the other day." The loser said, "What uncle?" I replied, "I don't know. Some guy who said he was your uncle, I guess." I described the man in the car. Then the loser replied, "I don't know who that is." "Okay," I replied. "Whatever. I don't know who that was. But they said they knew who you were. Even said your name." The look on his face completely changed. All the color drained from it. A mixture of shock, fear, and realization about something. But nothing was said after that. No one ever brought it up. I never thought about it again until I began to listen to scary stories, and realized what had happened to me wasn't nothing. It was something terrifying. As I found out later, the loser had enemies who truly hated him and were gang-affiliated. My conclusion with this situation was that the man who tried to give me a ride was a family member of said enemy, trying to get revenge by targeting people close to him. Since I was his girlfriend at the time, I was the perfect target. It was terrifying when I put the pieces together almost a decade later, thinking about what could have happened to me. I truly believe I might not be here right now. I'm grateful for the 1 second I saw that desperate behavior and was mindful enough to pick up on what was happening. I'm 28 years old now, happily married, and have 2 great boys in my life. Thank you for listening. I hope my story reaches many. Be safe out there. Predators are always present.
Story 5.
I'm Amanda, a 17-year-old girl who recently got a job doing yard work for an old woman we'll call Carly for privacy's sake. Let me give you some backstory so it's easier to understand. I got the job a few months ago to earn extra cash for a concert across the country. I had another job too, but it wasn't enough to save up in time. When I first arrived at Carly's house, it looked very overgrown and empty, so I thought I had the wrong address. Carly, my new boss, appeared as I double-checked the address. She asked if I was Bianca, and I said yes. She showed me around her house, and it was a little unsettling. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. She said she had been away for a few months, and the people who were house-sitting didn't respect the place. For the next few weeks, I just tidied up the area and weeded. She mentioned wanting more people to help her, so that's how my friend Amanda started working there. Another kid, David, joined around the same time as Amanda. This was his first job, and he was very young. A week leading up to the incident, I noticed David had stopped showing up for work. Amanda and I just assumed he quit, or maybe got fired, since Carly often complained about his laziness, unreliability, and how he'd lost all her tools. She'd even accused him of stealing a hand shovel. On the day of the incident, Amanda and I were weeding the front together. We don't usually work in the same area or together much, so it was nice to chat and work together. We had been working for a few hours before starting the front, so it was pretty warm when we began. We started talking about school subjects and upcoming tests when we got on the topic of David. "Do you know what happened to David?" "I haven't seen him for a while," I asked as I put weeds into a bucket. "Nah, I was going to ask you about him." "You think he quit?" Amanda replied. Before I could answer, Carly appeared in front of us, looking agitated. "He left. Now stop talking about that boy. He was the worst worker. And he never listened," she hissed, then turned and walked away. We exchanged looks of curiosity and unease. After that, we continued weeding in silence. An hour later, we filled 7 buckets of weeds and carried them to the back with a wheelbarrow. Once we got to the back, Carly told us to dump the weeds onto the compost heap and pile dirt on top. She also told us not to dig into the weeds already there, just to pile it on top. I was a bit confused because she usually told us to even out the weeds before adding dirt. Another thing, we hadn't done weeding for weeks, so the weeds on the heap would be gone by now. We got to the heap and were stunned to see a large pile in the middle of the compost. We shrugged and just dumped the weeds on the growing heap. Then we noticed a strong smell of weed tea. It's a liquid made from weeds and fish oil that's left out for a long time. The smell was really strong and putrid, with a slight undertone of dead animal too. I blamed it on the liquid as we started shoveling dirt over the weeds. Suddenly, I had the urge to see what the big heap was hiding. It wasn't like Carly to leave the heap unflattened if she wasn't hiding something. I began digging a small hole with my hands, an action I soon regretted. My fingers brushed something cold and stiff. I quickly recoiled my hand and peeked into the hole I made. I gasped loud enough to get Amanda's attention. She came over and looked down at the hole. She put her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Her face went pale. I could feel the blood draining from my own face, too. It was around 3 p.m., so we only had about an hour left. "We can't let her know we know. We have to act normal," I whispered to Amanda. She agreed. The rest of the time was a blur as we tried to act normal and finish our work. I felt eyes burning into the back of my neck, but kept acting as if nothing happened. Finally, my alarm went off, signaling we had minutes to pack up. I told Amanda, and we quickly packed our things. As we walked down the driveway, I turned to wave goodbye like usual, but changed my mind when I saw Carly standing there staring at us. She had a cold look in her eyes. We walked away quickly, and as soon as we were out of sight, Amanda and I started running home. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was following us. Once we got to my house, we called the cops. I told the operator everything through frantic breaths. We later found out that when the police arrived, the house was empty, and no one had lived there for a year, meaning Carly was a squatter. They also found David's body, dead and buried under the weeds. He'd been there for days, and we couldn't smell his decomposing body because of the weed tea that had been purposely placed there. Amanda and I moved away from that area. Even though it's been a while since the incident, I can't help but feel like Carly is still out there, watching.
Story 6.
It had been a rather dull day at work, with little to do and nothing to pass the time. I had been fiddling with some small stress toys on my desk, scrolling through Facebook, glancing at pictures of cute animals, and occasionally a Minion meme. Honestly, it was hard not to roll my eyes. Nothing seemed to be happening anywhere. A solid hour into my shift, I started to feel the familiar pull of daydreaming creeping into my mind. I let it take over, resting my chin on my palm, not sure how long I had been zoning out. I couldn't remember the specifics of my daydream, but it must have been all-consuming. Glancing at the clock, I tried to focus on the analog face, forcing my blurry eyes to make sense of the hours ticking by. Time was slipping away, I thought sarcastically, and started shuffling papers that had already been sorted countless times. We had no appointments today, but had to stay open in case a walk-in arrived. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I regretted applying to be a dental receptionist or if I was just this bored. Did I mention I was bored? I walked around the small booth organizing things that didn't need organizing, anything to keep busy. I had Mr. Creeps playing a podcast in the background, my mind drifting back to the monotony of my job. Then, I noticed someone in the lobby. Oddly, the bell didn't chime its usual melodic tune. Confused, I greeted him anyway. He was a short, pale man, maybe in his late 30s, clean-shaven, with a slight hunch in his back. His eyes were clear and sharp, which made me smile. I'd always loved customers like this. Witty banter is usually the best. "Hello. Please sign in at the kiosk. If you don't have an appointment, I'll need your ID and insurance card," I said, reciting my usual greeting. But when he spoke, the excitement left me, replaced by a gut-wrenching unease. His voice was even, yet there was something sharp in it, something primal. "Sure, but there's something I need from you first," he said, his words dripping with a strange malice. I stared at him, unsure what to make of it. "What can I do for you?" I asked. "Where's your bathroom?" he replied, his question catching me off guard. I had expected something much stranger, like him asking for the soul of my firstborn or something. Sure, it's down the hall, second on the left." He nodded and thanked me, and I watched him leave, still puzzled by the sudden fear that had overtaken me. I shook it off and sat back down, not thinking much of it. When the man didn't return, I assumed he'd left while I was on my phone. The rest of the day passed in a haze as the dentist left, and I had more time to update patient files. By now, I'd gotten used to the quiet after hours, and I found it relaxing. No one to distract me, just the paperwork to handle. I was elbows deep in patient files, wishing I'd done this earlier when I had more time, when I noticed something odd. The office door cracked open. Thinking it was the dentist, I didn't pay it much attention. I began piecing together x-rays for a patient, but then the door closed, and a shorter figure emerged, sitting in a chair far at the end of the lobby, nearly out of view from where I sat. I didn't know when I noticed, but something in the corner of my eye made me look. I froze. It was the same man from earlier, the one who asked about the bathroom. "Excuse me, we're closed now. We'll reopen in the morning, so I'll have to ask you to leave," I said, trying to sound calm. But he didn't move. Instead, he walked quickly toward me, long strides that I didn't understand, but I refused to acknowledge. He stood in front of me, whispering something too quiet to hear. I leaned over, trying to catch what he said. "You really need to leave before I call the authorities," I warned, but he grabbed my hair suddenly, yanking me forcefully across the desk. "When do you get off?" His voice was unnervingly calm. My heart raced as I pleaded with him to let me go, feeling my scalp burning from his grip, as if he might rip it from my head. He smiled, a grin so wide it was almost painful to look at. Then, he slammed my head down onto the desk, sending bursts of light and pain through my vision. I let out what was supposed to be a scream, but it came out as a yelp. When he pulled my head back, I could taste blood pouring from my mouth. My teeth had been cracked and knocked out. At one point, I bit my tongue, and I swear a shard of tooth lodged in it. I was terrified, crying and begging, but he slammed me down one more time before calmly gathering my teeth. As he did, he said, "Believe in the tooth fairy now, do you?" Then he fled the office, taking most of my teeth with him. I eventually went to the hospital and filed a police report, but they just assumed I'd hit my head too hard in a fight or an accident. They laughed at me and promised to investigate, but told me to watch out for some money under my pillow. If you have a job working in the woods, don't fool yourself into thinking it's a dream job. When hikers start going missing and something drags people into the creek, you'll wish you were home playing RuneScape instead.
Story 7.
The memory of the devouring flower. On the eve of departure, the red and yellow lights blazing above the northern sky, likely tantalizing the barbarous semi-humans who inhabited that frozen and unforgiving waste. The High Heliodora, Dorna Coronel, approached her least disastrous acolyte for final instructions. "You are to weed and water while we are gone on pilgrimage," she said, hissing her words through tight lips. "Should I remember to eat and drink as well? Perhaps to breathe?" "Yes, High Heliodora," said Lysariel. "It shall be done." The priestess regarded her acolyte with undisguised suspicion, narrowing her eyes as she searched her reply for insolence. Finding none, she closed the knapsack and slung it onto her back with a practiced ease. "Against my better judgment, you are also to be left the keys to the shrine," she said. Lysariel merely gaped, all propriety abandoned to the shock of what the Heliodora had just said. "Not my decision. I was outvoted," the priestess hedged, her displeasure showing in the way she threaded straps and cinched her waist belt. "Nevertheless, the councils will be done," she said. "For Grunima's sake," Lysariel stuttered, habit insisting even through her shock. "For Grunima's sake," agreed the Heliodora, who turned to leave, affixing the pax tumpline to her imperious habit-shrouded forehead. Halfway through the door to her cell, she tried to turn back to Lysariel, but she became momentarily stuck and had to be helped, a situation that improved her mood not at all, although now the acolyte knew why. "Keys to the shrine? I'm to tend the Heliorex?" "Remember," the priestess was grunting, trying to regain control of the ungainly knapsack. "Ashes, water, sunshine, nothing else. Do you hear me?" She advanced until her face was within inches of Lysariel's. "Nothing else." "It shall be done," she whispered. For a further moment, the Heliodora glared, then without warning or preamble, turned on her heel and marched from the room. Her tromping, booted footfalls, heavy with resentment and the temporary abdication she'd been forced into, echoed in the unadorned stone corridors of the Abbey. In the wake of her despondent exit, a deep silence settled on the Abbey, a silence that echoed not only in its halls, cells, and courtyards, but in Lysariel's heart and mind.
Gone! She's finally gone!
She sat on the bed, relishing that peace as long as she could, and the longer she sat, the more it metamorphosed into energy. Excitement and liberation thrummed electric in her ribcage, like heat lightning from a summer storm. All of the obsessive oversight, the weight of the Hyliadora's paranoid gaze, was gone. When she could take it no longer, and the excitement compelled her into motion, she leapt from the bed where she'd sat and ran out into the corridor. Her feet flew, her heart leapt, and before long they carried her out into the sunshine and the verdant smell of growing things, past the courtyard of herbs and medicines, where yarrow, sage, and clove grew fragrant and tame, past the gates, where a pair of brethren watched her run, probably assuming to bid the sojourners a fond farewell. She even ran past the small, well-tended beds of roses that climbed the exterior, protective walls of the abbey, where the hungry claw marks of great bears gouged the dark basalt, finally falling to her knees in the soft, tilled earth of her secret patch of cultivation, Grunima's highest calling. She delicately interlaced her fingers through the stalks of ghost irises, velthorn poppies, and black larkspur. The freedom to touch, never bruising the petals, not that, but to feel the tactile sensation of the plants against the pads of her fingers, was a forbidden bliss for which she had sufficient faith to feel at least a modicum of guilt. "Hello, my lovelies, at last we are alone." How the Hyliadora had discovered this secret patch of Lysariel's private projects, she had no idea. The woman had eyes and ears sprouting from her all over, it would seem. Her discovery, however, had earned her the only piece of praise she'd ever received from the woman. Earnest work, she had called it, a truth pruned so aggressively that it was likely to wither. Her experiments had yielded brilliant results, miraculous, huge. But, of course, all of that had come to an end once the great mistress of the abbey had discovered it, folding her acolyte's discoveries into her own domain. After that, all experimentation ceased. Only approved methods would be used moving forward. Lysariel's protestations had been met only with obdurate silence. So the growth that had marked them remarkable had also halted. The Hyliadora insisted that the doctrinally common fertilizers, pruning, and watering methods would lead to a better outcome in the long run, but refused to elaborate on what that meant exactly. Worse, she had never once asked how Lysariel had achieved the results she had, from bulb to bloom in a week. And now, stagnation. Well, that wasn't entirely fair. The flowers were not stagnating. They were merely natural. This left Lysariel deeply unsatisfied, feeling that she had been on the verge of a breakthrough, only to be curbed by the human embodiment of self-perpetuating tradition. Ironically, she was too blind to see that it was the rediscovery of an older tradition that had led to the rapid germination and growth of Lysariel's beloved flowers. With a reverence she had missed, Lysariel placed the palms of her hands against the clean earth, closed her eyes, and focused her mind. "Tavure Grunima," she said, barely above a whisper. "By my will, Osira, I become a Mirval." As though not even a day had passed since last performing the ritual, the furnace of Thalma ignited in her belly. Instantly she became aware of the remains of her breakfast, digesting in her stomach. Her blood, too, was full of fuel she could feed that hungry fire. Beyond that, she was also dimly aware of her body's fat stores, the fuel of last resort. But what need did a botanist have of that? The texts, molded, worm-eaten, and only half intelligible, from which she'd gleaned and then adapted. These techniques spoke of fat burning as tantamount to death from starvation, which confused her. Wouldn't a priestess of Grunima prevent starvation with her talents, rather than create it? Well, it didn't much matter in any event. She was always flush with food when she came to visit and nurture her little plants. The fire in her belly demanded it now that it was awake. "Zealosos marantara, seed to root. Gruthema, let the sacred soil be made. Tavure, hunger, I give that you may grow." At the invocation, the fire in her belly quickened, and she felt the nourishment she had taken flowing out of her, partly feeding the fire, but also lancing through her palms and into the soil. Through her connection, she sensed the richness with which she had invested her garden, far more than a handful of ashes could ever impart, and could even smell the promise of growth and bloom as its aroma rose from the warm soil. She ended the ritual before it burned more of her than she could spare. Lysariel stood, smiling, and admired her blooms. Already, they seemed to stand a little taller, their colors displaying a brilliance she had missed. Satisfied, she offered them a single, benevolent nod and left them to their growth. Then, she spun on her heel and skipped in the direction of the shrine. She had another secret to probe before the day darkened. The shrine to the Heliorex stood tall and vaulted on a crisply manicured lawn. The white limestone of the shrine featured tall, narrow windows of stained glass, and a pinnacle that featured an emblem of the sun in ever-bright hammered gold. The intended reverence, however, was somewhat muted by the common gardening equipment that the Heliorex's minders had leaned up against the building's white walls. A bucket, a watering gourd, and a bag of composted manure fertilizer all stood their post, looking listless and bored.
Time to meet the deific unblooming blossom.
The meaty stone key fitted the lock, though it turned only reluctantly. The bolt drew back with a sound like cracking bones, and Lysariel pushed the door, indistinguishable from the wall to the uninitiated, swung wide with surprising ease. If the lock had aged poorly, the shrine itself had clearly not. Coming face to face with the Heliorex, Lysariel's heart arrested for the space of 3 or 4 beats, then, mercifully, took up its old rhythm again. The bud was enormous, cyclopean even. It took up nearly the entire interior of the shrine, whose roof was twice again as tall as she, beyond mere height. It was also as big around as the trunk of an ancient sycamore she had once met, a tree so ancient that it had stood rooted across 8 generations of her progenitors. That encounter had left her awed. The sheer scale of it, combined with the visceral memory of her first thaumatic connection to a living thing, had convinced her she would recognize true size and age when she met them again. Now, standing in its presence, she knew to a certainty, that nothing could have prepared her for this encounter. She'd craved it, dreamed of it, but could never have imagined it.
Ash, water, and sunshine? And that's all? I don't believe it. Can't believe it.
The common temples to Grunima, which peppered rural townships, concerned themselves with fertility, crop rotation, irrigation, and the countless methods of sustainable cultivation that kept civilization fed. This, in turn, allowed for the development of the arts, philosophy, economics, and craft, and yet it was mostly sustained by water, fertilizer, and sunshine. Somehow Lysariel found the idea that this enormous, impossible blossom had been cultivated and brought to its current size only through pedestrian application of Grunima's arts offensive. Perhaps it was because she knew the abbey was at least as ancient as the rituals she'd dug up in Grunima's library at the basilica. Perhaps it was because she knew those rituals shaved time off of the cultivation calendar. Perhaps it was because she wanted to be the one to bring it to blossom. Whatever the reason, Lysariel the acolyte did not hesitate even briefly before plunging her fingers into the scrawny patch of bare soil surrounding the Heliorex.
Tavure, Grunima!
Where before the incantation had been a reverent whisper, now she spoke it with the fire of her conviction. In response, the fire in her belly kindled, not into the timid flame that usually awoke, but as a blazing brazier. Even in the heat of ambition, Lysariel did brace herself as she extended a hand to touch the bud. What would she sense when she connected to it? A part of her wondered what the Heliorex even was. Certainly there was no other plant like it in the world. This thing was the abbey's entire purpose. A delicate velveteen coated the outside of the bud. Distantly, it reminded her of loquat leaves in early spring. It was, however, the only similarity she could draw between the alien plant and her own, admittedly extensive, tactile experience regarding the green and growing things of the world. Otherwise, it felt spongy and pregnant, somehow. More, even before she extended herself into the bud, she sensed its anticipation, as if it had been waiting. For her, maybe, or someone like her. Someone who knew what she did, could do what she could. When she spoke the incantation, it poured from her as poetry. Gruthema Osira, my root to yours. Emerval in flesh, Zelisos in will. I open and become. As the power, Thama in the language of the long dark Mercevian Empire, extended from her palm and into the plant, at first all went as she had expected and had experienced before, but as her essence penetrated it, the Heliorex reached out through the connection and seized her mind. Lysariel felt the will of the Heliorex expressed not as fingers, but as tendrils of vine. A part of her knew this was only a mental manifestation of the plant's identity, just as her own essence had taken the shape of fingers, but that did nothing to dull the sensation. Ivy crawling into her skull, wrapping itself around her brain. She screamed, first in surprise, and then in pain as the vines bore down on the gray lump of meat behind her eyes. But no echo answered her. The shrine swallowed the sound the way dry, overturned soil drank rain. Then she began to see, to remember, and in her final moments to be. Lysariel was a citizen of the sky, walking roads paved with a spongy flesh that reminded her of jellyfish. She went barefoot on these roads because life in the Sky City disregarded the need for shoes. Everything there was comfort, made to conform to the human shape. Nothing so intractable as steel or stone existed up there. The hardest substance they knew was crystal, and that was so responsive that it would grow or degenerate at a thought or a gesture. Only, at the center of the city was the thing, the machine, the chaos engine, the choir of endings. A part of her wanted to dismiss it. Every Calanthian knew of it, though none of them had been told anything about it precisely. They simply knew, in that shared special way they had, that none of the ground-walking humans of the world seemed to share. Yet, despite the lack of telling, and that special way of knowing, none of them seemed to know precisely what it did, if it did anything at all at the present, or would do. If the terrible machine was merely dormant and waiting to be switched on, nobody knew. Everyone was afraid. A dormant manifold stirred as she passed, and she felt her insides shiver. She'd heard stories, recently about them, the flesh engines that ran Calanthea. Rumors of rebellion, which was so remotely improbable as to be ridiculous, and of nascent sapience among them, which was outright impossible, were beginning to circulate in the art houses and forums of the city. With a shiver, she dismissed these disquieting rumors, and tried to enjoy her walk. Overhead, a sky leviathan flew its lazy track across the sky, a rider on its back, singing its strange song in perfect, distant harmony. Watching them brought her a moment of peace, of freedom she could forget. At times like these. And then, behind her now, the supposedly dormant manifolds stirred again. Hadn't all the surplus manifolds been deactivated, just for peace of mind? Hadn't they council announced that they'd all? Harder this time, she pushed the thought away. Things were peaceful. The rumors were merely a potent piece of gossip. But a part of her still stirred. A part of her thoughts lingered on the choir of endings. A part of her wondered. All of these things passed through Lysariel's mind at the speed of dreams. It was felt, thought, sensed, and over in a breath. Then her brain burst like an overripe fruit in a tightening fist. Blood cascading from her nostrils, she collapsed onto the soil. This time, the actual tendrils of the plant, which ran underneath not only the shrine, but the entire abbey and even into the very bed frames on which the priests slept, engulfed her and dragged her beneath the soil. One of the Brotherhood discovered the open door to the shrine and sighed. He saw the freshly turned earth, knowing what it signified. Another one, then. Taking a moment before relocking the shrine, he took a moment to gaze up at the Heliorex. Was it larger? He thought it was, as though an infusion of hearty fertilizer had fed the thing. In some ways it was too bad, in others it was inevitable. Inexorably, humans were drawn to repeat the mistakes of ancient Calanth. They craved dangerous knowledge, power, and true autonomy, which any humble fool would understand was merely an illusion of the mind. Never mind that almost no living human had ever heard of the fallen cities of that long lost civilization, or of the relics, potent, thaumatic, and incredibly dangerous, that they had left behind. The Heliorex, of course, was one of these. As best as they understood, it had been a part of a living archive, used to store the memories of citizens for posterity. Once, supposedly, there had been thousands. Now, there was just the one. Well, the patriarchs and matriarchs at the highest levels did not want the thing destroyed, even if it could be destroyed. But they didn't seem to want its knowledge to spread either. So they cultivated it, kept it contained, and avoided interacting with it in a way that might stimulate it, make it remember. And yet, it had eaten another acolyte, apparently. What had she fed it? Manure? Foolishness. That was why it got her. She'd awakened the thing, Ashes were enough, though only barely. Keep it starving, keep it quiet. And yet, every once in a while, an acolyte with delusions would try to prod it into wakefulness, whether they knew that's what they were doing or not, just so long as none of them learned whatever it knew. The nameless brother closed the door, ruminating. He was not looking forward to telling the Heliodora. This was the third acolyte she'd lost to this foolishness in her lifetime.